I think we've had a lot of interesting discussion here today about the pros and cons of new technologies, new forms of data. So I thought I would try and help us end the day on a bit of a high note, at least for me, and tell you a story about an occasion when some of these new approaches and new data forms helped us solve a problem that had been giving us a bit of a headache. So, I'm sure nobody here is particularly relishing the thought of heading back out into today's dull and dreary weather. So I thought it was a good moment to remind you all that partially thanks to our much beloved British weather, we've got some beautiful places in this country. So if you consider this picture, this is a picture of the Lake District. So I grew up not too far from the Lake District. And I used to really love spending time there because it's beautiful. And so being in this beautiful location would make me feel better. Now, up there in the top right-hand corner, that is Dr. Chiniki Sarasenia. I'm very proud to say she finished her PhD just a month ago in the data science lab at WBS that I direct with my colleague Tobias Price. And so Chiniki, Tobias and I, we were looking at pictures like this. And we were looking at the huge volumes of photographs that we all tend to leave behind online today. And wondering, is there not a way that we could start to get some quantitative insight into the way a place looks and the way that we feel? Now, the cold, hard truth is that, even when I was growing up, it wasn't all about just having holidays in the Lake District. I had to go off to school. My parents had to go off to work. So really, the important question we thought is about how the environment in the place we live might relate to how healthy we feel. Now, thanks to the Office for National Statistics, we've got some good data on how healthy we all feel. As I'm sure you all know, there's a census every 10 years. And one of the questions on the census asks you to report on your health. So you can say you feel everything from very bad to very good. And so we can use that data, and we have to do some work with it before we can start analysing it. For example, people who are older tend to report their health to be worse. Men actually tend to report their health to be worse than women. But so once we take these things into account, we can plot it, and it looks like this. So lighter areas are areas where people reported their health to be worse. So you can see pretty quickly there's cities such as London and Liverpool that haven't come out as well as places further away from these urban centres.
What's going on in Devon?
It's a good question. It's one we should come back to. Yeah, right. Well, I'll come back to that. I will come back to that. So yeah, it's a good point. Okay, so we've got this national scale, well, I've shown you England here for reasons of data linkage, but we've got this national scale data on how healthy people feel. And the question we faced was, how do we get this sort of scale of data on how attractive different places are? Now, the answer to this question came to us in the shape of a game that an organisation called My Society set up back in 2009. It's called Scenic or Not. I'm happy to now say it now lives in our lab at Warwick. Scenic or Not shows you pictures like this one, and it asks you to rate them. So if you think it's very scenic, you can give it 10. If you think it looks awful, you can give it 1, or you can pick something in between. These pictures in turn, they come from another game called Geograph. So Geograph is a game where you get points for uploading pictures in as many kilometre squares of Great Britain as you can. So on the back of Geograph and Scenic or Not, we've got over 1.5 million ratings for over 200,000 locations across Great Britain. So we can map that too. And it looks like this. So darker areas are areas that people rated as more scenic. So up in the north, the Lake District, so everybody agrees with me. Everyone appears to agree with Sophia as well, that it's actually pretty nice down towards Cornwall. But you can see that areas such as London are not doing so well. So what we wondered is, okay, well, what's going to happen if we put the data on how scenic people rate places to be, together with the data on how healthy people report themselves to be? And the answer is that people who live in areas that are rated as more scenic report their health to be better. Now, if you've just been looking at those last two maps, I hope you're thinking, wait a minute, is this not a bit obvious, right? We just pointed out that the cities are not being rated as so scenic, and the cities are places where people are reporting their health to be worse. So is this not just something super trivial about whether people live in the city or not? So this is something we wondered as well. So we split England into urban, suburban, and rural areas, and we looked at whether this relationship held in those categories of areas on their own. And the answer is, for all three, yes, it does. So even if you just look at cities, where it is true, you don't really find places that get the stellar scores that the Lake District does, there's still a relationship. So people who live in parts of those cities that have been rated as more scenic still report their health to be better. Now, even with the city and country thing out of the way, you might say, well, wait a minute, there's still something really obvious that might explain this. What about money, right? So if people have got more money, more income, then they might draw on that income to look after their health. And they might say, you know what, I'll use some of that too to pick a nicer, more attractive place to live. So we wondered that too, but thankfully the government makes lots of data on these sorts of socioeconomic characteristics available. So we put that into the model as well. And while there is a relationship between, for example, income and how healthy people report themselves to be, it's not enough to explain this relationship. A final thing you might wonder looking at this picture is that even if you agree with me that the Lake District is quite beautiful, you might think, well, yeah, but it's also pretty green, right? So have we maybe not just found a really complicated way of measuring how green places are? Now, thankfully, we have data on how green places are. People have been able to measure that for much longer than we've had this data on how scenic places are. You can just take some aerial photography, you can look at how green different places are, put that data together, and you can plot it. And so that looks a bit like this. So darker areas are areas that are greener, and yeah, you can see the Lake District, as you might have expected, is indeed also very green. But if you compare that map to a map of how attractive, how scenic different places are, you'll see that while there are similarities, they're not exactly the same. So for example, towards the east of England, you start to find some places where they're scoring higher marks for how green they are, but you're not seeing the same sort of increase in terms of how scenic they are. So what we wondered is, okay, which of these data sets is going to help us best explain differences in how healthy people report themselves to be? So we built 3 models. All of them included those socioeconomic variables I was talking about. But so then in one model, we added the green space data, in another, the scenicness data, and in a third, both of those data sources. And what we found was that there was very little evidence that we could afford to throw away the data on how scenic places were. So by this particular analysis, if you look at urban areas, for example, the model that we had the most evidence for out of those 3 models we'd considered was the model that just looked at the data on aesthetics. So we were quite excited. Looked like we had a first piece of evidence in line with the idea that the way a place looks might not just be nice to have, but it might have some consequences for something as important to us as our health. I should be really clear though and say, what we've got here is a correlation. I'd be going a bit too far to say we've got really strong causal evidence here. We haven't. There's a number of things that we haven't yet ruled out. So in particular, I can't tell you for sure, it's not the case that people who feel healthier decide to up sticks and move to a place that looks more attractive. So that's something that we're trying to grapple with at the moment, alongside a number of other ways we might want to try and explain this relationship. We've looked at things like pollution and some of the other explanations I've shown you, but it's an ongoing battle on the causality front. But even if we put that to the side for a minute and we thought, well, what if we got so far that we really thought there is a causal relationship? It's really the case that, living in a more attractive area makes people feel healthier. We'd still have some questions to ask. You'd still want to ask, well, why? Is it that being in a more attractive place makes people go out and do more exercise, and that's why they feel healthier? Or is it that being in a more attractive place makes people feel happier, and that's why they feel healthier? Now, the topic of happiness was an interesting one for us, because traditionally, much like aesthetics, it's been pretty tricky to measure. So, you could, for example, you could do an experiment. You could take a particular situation or set of situations, and you could ask people some questions before you put them in this situation, and some questions after you put them in the situation, and you could try and measure whether that had made them happier or not. But the trouble with that sort of experimental approach is you generally end up with a relatively small number of people and a relatively small set of scenarios that you've considered. There have been approaches that have tried to measure elements of the complicated construct that is happiness at national scale. So tried to ask people all over the country about, for example, their life satisfaction. But asking that many people on a regular basis has traditionally been very resource intensive, and that's reduced the frequency with which we've normally got those measurements. So for example, we've often only had measurements once a year. And if you've only got those measurements once a year, that's not really giving you the sense of the possible impact of these daily things that affect our happiness that we might be interested in. So for that reason, we were very happy to start collaborating with George McCarran from the University of Sussex. So George had created an app called Mappiness. Now, Mappiness is an app that pings you a couple of times a day, and it asks you how happy you're feeling. It also asks you some other questions, such as who you're with or what you're doing at the moment. And on the back of Mappiness, we got access to over 3 years of data for how the happiness of over 15,000 people. So if you're sitting on that volume of happiness measurements, you start to see some patterns. So for example, I can reveal that thankfully tomorrow, everything's going to start looking a bit better. I didn't pick the best month to give this talk, unfortunately. But these large patterns aside, we can start to ask the questions we were originally interested in. So we can ask, is it really the case that people feel happier when they're in more attractive locations, taking into account a whole multitude of other things that might have had an influence on how happy they feel? And the conclusion we draw from this data is that, yes, they do. Even if we take into account whether an area is natural or built up, how green it is, whether it's urban, suburban, or rural, as well as a whole number of other things I didn't want to distress you by trying to fit onto this slide. So to do with the weather, what people are doing, who they're with, etc., etc. So you can see from the small sample of other factors that I've shown you here that we can even quantify, the size of effect that you might expect from somebody moving from a least possible scenic area to the most possible scenic area. You can see it's roughly in the area of the improvement of happiness you might see from somebody listening to music. It's about the inverse of what we seem to see when people report that they're travelling or commuting. So, this complemented the evidence we had relating to how healthy people reported themselves to be. It seemed that, there really was a relationship. Being in more attractive areas made people report that, or made as strong, but people would report that they felt healthier or happier. So we had these relationships that we saw in the data where people were reporting themselves to be healthier or feel healthier, people reporting themselves to feel happier in areas that were rated as more attractive. And so we went off and we spoke to planners about these relationships, and they'd say, well, that's nice, but what makes a place more attractive? And we went, oh, just, let us go off and look at our pile of 200,000 photographs. looked a little baffled at each other. I thought, okay, we'll find, planners like cities. We'll find, the photographs that got high ratings in cities, thumbed through a few, and came back and said, we think people like bridges. It wasn't really the answer we wanted to come up with. It was very hand-wavy. We'd put all this effort into trying to come up with quantitative conclusions. This was absolutely not in the slightest a quantitative conclusion. However, as many of you may realise, there have been some fairly considerable improvements in recent years in the capacity of computers to understand what is in an image. So we realised that rather than, trying as humans to stare at this, very intimidating pile of images, what we could do is try and feed them to a computer instead and see if that could tell us what was in the images. So we then had some quantitative data and could relate that to how scenic people had rated these photographs to be. So specifically, what we did is we fed all of the photographs into something that's called a convolutional neural networks, kind of deep learning approach, specifically places, CNN, something that was developed at MIT. If you feed a photograph like this one, scored 10 on Scenic or not, into places CNN, it'll spit out some numbers relating to what it thinks is in the photograph. So this one gets some relatively high scores for whether there's a valley, whether there's there's a lake there. There's also, rather than just what kind of place is it, there's scene attributes. So what sort of thing do we see in the scene? So you can see we get a high score for natural light there. So with the place categories and scene attributes, overall we had over 300 features that we had ratings for each photograph. So we could then take those ratings and put them into a particular kind of regression model. So we used something called an elastic net to try and help us cope with the fact that a lot of these features were going to be somewhat correlated. And we could see, okay, well, which features tend to be related to higher scenic ratings and lower scenic ratings. So we have got some sort of answer for all 300, but if I pick out the top few, some of the initial top-level results we saw, a little on the obvious side, right? So turns out it's not just me who likes lakes. Lakes were leading a lot of people to score photographs highly. Similarly, valleys, boosting the scores. On the other hand, industrial areas, not really helping the score of the photograph, nor were buildings that the neural net thought looked like a hospital. So, okay, looks like the natural places are doing pretty well. The built-up places are not doing so well. But if you start digging into the data a bit more, so you consider urban built-up areas where many of us live, you start to see the story isn't quite that straightforward. So, for example, you see that some buildings with character, such as cottages or castles, will boost the score. To my delight, bridges, viaducts and aqueducts, turns out, it was hand-wavy, but actually we were right. People do like bridges. So they were boosting the scores as well. So we've got these built elements that boost the score, while it wasn't exactly the case that all the natural elements were helping. So trees, green trees, they were increasing scores, but large areas of grass, athletic fields, they were, when you put everything else into the mix, pulling the scores down. So this was of particular interest to us because there's been, quite a lot of public health briefings, investigations around the importance of green space. In no way are we trying to say that green space is not important, but just that on the basis of the analyses we've carried out so far, it looks like probably the story is a little bit more nuanced. That, previously we had easy access to green space data for the reasons I explained, but, how aesthetically attractive something looks, that's obvious to us as humans, but we didn't have that large-scale quantitative data on it before to try and make large-scale inferences. So, we're excited about the scenic or not data. We're excited about the fact we've got a computer to stop us coming up with very dubious answers when the planners asked us what was going on in our big pile of photographs. But there were still some things we were hoping we might be able to improve. So scenic or not, the data set was great, but it was based on the approach that we'd got one photograph for every kilometre squared. So we've got one rating for every kilometre squared. So that covers, there's a lot of ratings across the country as a whole. But if you start to think of cities, it'd be nice to have a few more ratings than that. Now, actually, Geograph, although you get points for every kilometre squared, it's got loads of photographs in every kilometre squared. There's loads of people who've tried to upload photographs. So we've got the photos there. The question was, well, how could we get the ratings? So we could get more people to rate them. But we wondered, well, could we actually get a neural net to help us with that too? So instead of the neural network just telling us what was in the photograph, could we get it to tell us how attractive the photograph was? And the answer was, on the whole, yes, we could. So this is a map of the centre of London. So all the dots represent locations of Geograph photographs, tons of them, as you can see. Red dots relate to areas that have not been rated so highly, and blue dots relate to areas that have been rated so highly. And these ratings come from a neural net that was an evolution of Places CNN. So we'd taken the neural net that they set up at MIT, and we'd trained it further by showing it the photographs that we had from Scenic or not and the scores that they had. So it had learned to output Scenic scores instead of just outputting information about what was in the picture. So this is what it output when we fed in all of the photographs from London. You can see it loves parks, right? It's drawn blue dots all over them. And indeed, when we asked the CNN, okay, give us your top 5% locations in London, it did pick up on places like Hampstead Heath. So, very green, natural places came out. But there were, in that top 5%, interestingly, also places like Big Ben and the Tower of London. So built locations that we know as perhaps attractive, I would say so myself. But in line with the conclusions we'd drawn before about buildings with character also boosting the score of a scene. In no way is the Geograph data set perfect, for sure. So the data that we've trained it off is the data where we've got one dot for every kilometre squared. So then it's, right? So it wasn't trained on the data I'm showing you here. It was trained on the Scenic or not data, or a subset of it, and then we tested it on another subset. And then for London, this is a bunch of photographs that we didn't have ratings for, but the photographs were available. So, we could have got people to rate these, but actually we did pretty well at getting a neural net to rate them for us. So that, also gives you a sense of how, if this sort of variable might be useful to policymakers, one approach would be to get people to rate lots of photographs for them, but we can make a pretty good estimate of how attractive places are at huge scale by feeding them through a CNN. And again, if you're talking about just one picture, obviously a human or a group of humans can give you some opinions on whether it looks attractive or not. But if you're trying to kind of understand a place at scale, that's where you start to get the problem we had with our 200,000 photographs, and being able to automate it and generate these estimates at large scale might be really useful for valuing of environments. So, to summarize, I've given you some evidence drawing on deep learning methodologies that scenic locations are not just natural locations. They're also not just green locations, but we do have at least some initial evidence in line with the suggestion that scenic locations might not just be a nice to have. They might actually have consequences for something as important to us as our health and our happiness. Thank you very much.